My name is Linda Carter, and I'm 52 years old. 3 months ago, I made what I thought was the most compassionate decision of my life when I hired a home nurse to care for my son Michael after his devastating car accident. What started as an act of motherly love quickly turned into the most manipulative, boundary-crossing nightmare I never saw coming. When 24-year-old Jessica Morgan moved herself into my master bedroom claiming my son needed around-the-clock supervision, I discovered that some people will exploit tragedy for their own twisted agenda. My family called me heartless when I finally took action, and my neighbors whispered that I was jealous of a younger woman. But sometimes protecting your home and your family means making decisions that others will never understand. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 6 months ago, my world collapsed in a single phone call that every parent dreads. I was sitting in my office at Riverside High School, reviewing disciplinary reports from the day's incidents, when my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. The voice on the other end belonged to a nurse at Riverside General Hospital, and her words hit me like a physical blow. Michael had been in a serious car accident. A drunk driver had run a red light and slammed into my son's car at 45 miles per hour, leaving him with a traumatic brain injury, 3 broken ribs, and partial paralysis in his left leg. The months that followed were a blur of hospital visits, insurance battles, and watching my vibrant 28-year-old son struggle to relearn basic tasks that had once been second nature. Michael had always been independent, working as a graphic designer from his downtown apartment, dating a sweet girl named Rebecca who worked at the local bank, and planning a future that suddenly seemed impossible. The accident didn't just steal his mobility. It shattered his confidence and left him feeling like a burden on everyone around him. When the doctors finally cleared him to leave the hospital, there was never any question about where he would go. Michael would come home to the house where he'd grown up, the same 2-story colonial on Maple Street where I'd raised him and his sister Amanda after their father Robert and I divorced 8 years ago. I converted the downstairs guest room into a temporary bedroom, installed grab bars in the main floor bathroom, and rearranged furniture to accommodate his wheelchair and walker. The transition home should have been a relief, but it quickly became overwhelming. Michael needed help with everything from showering to preparing meals, and his physical therapy appointments 3 times a week left him exhausted and frustrated. As much as I wanted to be there for everything, my job as vice principal at the high school demanded long hours, especially during the spring semester when graduation planning and end-of-year activities consumed most of my time. Rebecca had tried to help initially, but watching the man she loved struggle with basic functions proved too emotionally difficult for her. She started visiting less frequently, making excuses about work obligations and family commitments. Within 6 weeks of Michael's homecoming, she had quietly ended their relationship with a tearful conversation about needing space to figure things out. The breakup devastated Michael, adding emotional trauma to his already overwhelming physical challenges. That's when my best friend Sarah Chen suggested hiring professional help. Sarah had been teaching at the elementary school for 15 years and had seen several families navigate similar situations with aging parents or disabled relatives. She recommended Golden Care Home Health Agency, a reputable local company that specialized in providing certified nursing assistants for in-home care. The idea made perfect sense. Professional help would ensure Michael received proper care while allowing me to maintain my work responsibilities and some semblance of normal life. I called Golden Care on a Tuesday morning in February, speaking with a supervisor named Margaret who explained their services and screening process. They would send someone qualified to assist with Michael's daily needs, help with his physical therapy exercises, prepare meals, and provide companionship during his recovery. The cost was significant, but Michael's insurance would cover most of it, and I had savings set aside for emergencies. Margaret assured me they would match us with someone experienced in caring for young adults with traumatic injuries. 3 days later, Jessica Morgan knocked on my front door carrying a small suitcase and wearing scrubs decorated with cheerful cartoon characters. She was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 20s, with long blonde hair pulled back in a neat ponytail and bright blue eyes that sparkled with enthusiasm. Her smile was warm and professional as she introduced herself and explained that she had 2 years of experience working with patients recovering from accidents and surgeries. Jessica's credentials seemed solid. She was a certified nursing assistant with additional training in physical therapy support, and she carried references from 3 previous families who praised her dedication and compassionate care. During our initial meeting, she asked thoughtful questions about Michael's condition, his therapy goals, and his interests outside of his medical needs. She seemed genuinely interested in helping him regain independence and confidence, which was exactly what I hoped for. The first few weeks with Jessica went better than I could have imagined. She arrived each morning at 7:30, prepared nutritious breakfasts that Michael actually ate, and encouraged him to participate in his therapy exercises even when he felt discouraged. She had a gift for making conversation that distracted him from his pain and frustration, talking about movies, books, and current events in a way that made him feel like a normal person rather than a patient. Michael's mood improved dramatically with Jessica's presence. He started smiling again, looking forward to their daily activities, and even began working on some freelance graphic design projects that Jessica helped him organize. She set up a comfortable workspace in the living room where he could use his computer and drawing tablet, and she celebrated each small accomplishment as if it were a major victory. I felt immense gratitude for Jessica's impact on my son's recovery. Coming home from work to find Michael engaged in conversation, laughing at something on television, or working on a project felt like witnessing a miracle. The guilt I'd been carrying about not being able to provide round-the-clock care began to ease as I watched Jessica seamlessly handle tasks that had been overwhelming me for months. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Jessica was also helpful around the house in ways that went beyond her official duties. She would tidy up the living areas, do Michael's laundry, and sometimes prepare dinner for both of them when I had to work late. She seemed to anticipate needs before they arose and handled unexpected situations with calm competence. When Michael had a panic attack during a thunderstorm that reminded him of the night of his accident, Jessica stayed with him for hours, using breathing techniques and gentle conversation to help him work through his anxiety. The arrangement felt almost too good to be true, which should have been my first warning sign. I'd been a single mother long enough to know that perfect solutions rarely exist, especially when dealing with complex medical and emotional challenges. But I was so relieved to see Michael improving and so grateful for the support that I ignored the small inconsistencies that began appearing in Jessica's behavior. It started with little things that seemed insignificant at the time. Jessica began arriving earlier each morning, sometimes by 7 o'clock, explaining that she wanted to help Michael with his morning routine before I left for work. She stayed later in the evenings, often until 8 or 9 o'clock, saying that Michael had requested her help with various projects or activities. When I suggested she didn't need to work such long hours, she insisted that she didn't mind, and that Michael seemed to benefit from the extended companionship. Jessica also began making herself more comfortable in our home, storing personal items in the kitchen cabinets, keeping a change of clothes in Michael's bathroom, and gradually taking over household tasks that weren't part of her job description. She rearranged furniture to better accommodate Michael's needs, which was thoughtful, but she did so without asking my permission or discussing the changes with me first. The boundary crossing that should have alarmed me most was how Jessica began positioning herself as the primary decision-maker regarding Michael's care. She would schedule additional therapy appointments without consulting me, adjust his medication schedule based on her observations, and speak on his behalf during phone calls with doctors or insurance representatives. When I questioned these actions, she would explain that she was simply being proactive and that Michael had asked her to handle these responsibilities. Michael seemed genuinely happy with Jessica's increased involvement in his life, which made it difficult for me to voice concerns without seeming unsupportive of his recovery. He praised her dedication constantly, telling me how lucky we were to have found someone who cared so much about his progress. He started referring to Jessica as his lifeline and expressing anxiety about what would happen when he eventually no longer needed her services. The first major red flag came when I arrived home early from work one afternoon and found Jessica wearing one of my sweaters. She claimed that Michael had spilled soup on her shirt and that she'd borrowed the sweater from my closet to avoid being inappropriate in front of him. The explanation seemed reasonable, but something about the situation felt wrong. The sweater was one of my favorites, an expensive cashmere pullover that I only wore on special occasions, and it seemed odd that Jessica would choose it over more casual options that were readily available. That same week, I noticed that Jessica had begun expressing opinions about my parenting decisions and household management that went far beyond her role as Michael's caregiver. She suggested that I was working too much and not spending enough quality time with my son during his recovery. She recommended changes to our grocery shopping habits, proposing that she handle the shopping since she better understood Michael's dietary needs and preferences. Most concerning was Jessica's growing tendency to speak about Michael's future, as if she would be a permanent part of it. She would make comments about long-term goals, potential career changes, and lifestyle adjustments, using language that included herself in the planning. When I reminded her that the goal was Michael's eventual independence, she would agree, but then continue making references to ongoing support and assistance that extended far beyond typical recovery timelines. The situation reached a tipping point on a Friday evening in late April when I came home from a particularly challenging day at school to find Jessica asleep in my master bedroom. Michael explained that she had been feeling unwell and had asked to lie down for a few minutes. He'd directed her to my room because it was the most comfortable space in the house, and she'd apparently fallen asleep while resting. I woke Jessica gently and helped her gather her things, assuming she would go home to recover from whatever illness had made her feel faint. Instead, she insisted that she was feeling better, but worried about leaving Michael alone overnight since he'd been experiencing increased pain and anxiety that week. She asked if she could sleep in the guest room upstairs to be available if he needed assistance during the night. The request seemed reasonable given Michael's recent struggles, and I agreed to let Jessica stay overnight as a temporary measure. I provided fresh linens for the guest room and assumed this would be a one-time arrangement to address a specific concern about Michael's condition. That temporary overnight stay turned into a permanent living situation so gradually that I didn't realize what was happening until it was already established. Jessica began staying overnight several times a week, always with explanations about Michael's needs or concerns about his safety. She started keeping toiletries in the guest bathroom, hanging clothes in the closet, and storing personal belongings throughout the house. Within 2 weeks, Jessica was essentially living in my home full-time while continuing to receive payment for her professional services. She had transformed from a hired caregiver into an uninvited houseguest who acted as if she belonged in our family. The most disturbing part was that she had somehow convinced Michael that her constant presence was medically necessary for his recovery, making it difficult for me to object without seeming to prioritize my comfort over my son's health. The final straw came when I discovered Jessica had moved her belongings into my master bedroom while I was attending a mandatory school district meeting that lasted until late evening. She claimed that the guest room had become too warm for comfortable sleeping, and that Michael had suggested she use my room since I was working late anyway. She assured me this was temporary, just until she could find a better sleeping arrangement, but her tone and body language suggested she had no intention of moving back to the guest room. Standing in my own bedroom doorway, looking at Jessica's clothes hanging in my closet and her personal items arranged on my nightstand, I realized that I had allowed a complete stranger to take over my home and manipulate my son's recovery for her own purposes. The woman I had hired to help my family had instead created a situation where I felt like a guest in my own house, walking on eggshells to avoid disrupting arrangements that benefited everyone except me. That night, lying in the guest room that now felt foreign and uncomfortable. I finally understood that Jessica's behavior wasn't about providing exceptional care for Michael. It was about ingratiating herself into our lives so completely that removing her would seem cruel and unreasonable. She had used my son's vulnerability and my own desperation to create a scenario where questioning her presence made me appear selfish and ungrateful. The manipulation was sophisticated and effective because it was wrapped in genuine care and concern for Michael's well-being. Jessica hadn't done anything overtly harmful or inappropriate. She had simply gradually expanded her role and presence until she had become indispensable. By the time I recognized what was happening, she had positioned herself as essential to Michael's recovery and had made me the outsider in my own family dynamic. Looking back, I realize how perfectly I had fit into everyone's expectations of what a devoted mother should do when her child faces a life-altering crisis. The script was written long before Jessica ever entered our lives, and I had been following it without question since the moment I received that devastating phone call from the hospital. Society has very clear ideas about maternal sacrifice, and I had embraced every single one of them without considering the cost to my own well-being or autonomy. The expectation was simple and absolute. As Michael's mother, I should dedicate every available moment, every ounce of energy, and every financial resource to his recovery. My own needs became irrelevant the moment his life changed, and anyone who suggested otherwise was seen as selfish or inadequately committed to family. The unspoken rule was that good mothers disappear into their children's crises, emerging only when the situation resolves or they collapse from exhaustion. My colleagues at Riverside High School reinforced these expectations with their well-meaning but misguided support. Principal Martinez assured me that the school would accommodate any schedule changes needed for Michael's care, but the underlying message was clear that my professional responsibilities should take a back seat to my role as caregiver. Other staff members shared stories about relatives who had made similar sacrifices, always framing complete self-abandonment as admirable and necessary. The parents in our community added another layer of pressure with their mixture of sympathy and judgment. They expressed horror at Michael's situation while simultaneously evaluating my response for adequacy. Coffee conversations at the local cafe became minefields, where I had to demonstrate sufficient devastation and dedication to earn their approval. Any mention of my own struggles or needs was met with awkward silence or gentle redirection back to Michael's condition. Even my ex-husband Robert, who had been largely absent from our children's lives since our divorce, suddenly became an expert on proper parental response to crisis. During his infrequent visits to see Michael, he would make pointed comments about the importance of family unity during difficult times and how children needed to know their parents would sacrifice anything for their well-being. The irony of receiving parenting advice from someone who had chosen his new wife and stepchildren over maintaining close relationships with his own biological children was not lost on me, but pointing out this hypocrisy would only make me look bitter and defensive. My daughter Amanda, calling from her apartment 3 states away where she worked in marketing for a tech startup, added emotional complexity to the situation with her mixture of genuine concern and subtle guilt-tripping. She couldn't leave her job to help with Michael's care, which was completely understandable given her career stage and financial obligations, but she compensated for this absence by becoming hyper-vigilant about my caregiving decisions. Every phone conversation included detailed questions about Michael's progress, therapy schedules, and my level of involvement in his daily care. Amanda had inherited her father's tendency to offer opinions without accepting responsibility, and she frequently suggested additional treatments, specialists, or support services that I should pursue for Michael's benefit. When I explained the financial or logistical challenges of implementing her suggestions, she would express disappointment that I wasn't willing to try everything possible. The implication was always that a truly dedicated mother would find a way to overcome any obstacle, regardless of the personal cost. The medical professionals involved in Michael's care added another layer of expectation with their assumption that family caregivers would simply absorb whatever responsibilities needed to be managed. Physical therapists scheduled appointments. Without considering my work schedule, social workers provided resource lists that required extensive research and coordination, and doctors offered treatment recommendations that presumed unlimited time and energy for implementation. Insurance companies operated under the same assumption, creating Byzantine approval processes that required constant phone calls, paperwork submissions, and appeals for basic services. The system was designed around the expectation that someone in the family would serve as a full-time advocate and coordinator, managing the endless bureaucracy without compensation or recognition. Church members and neighbors contributed their own expectations wrapped in offers of help that rarely materialized into actual assistance. They would stop me at the grocery store or in the school parking lot to ask about Michael's progress and offer vague promises of support. These conversations always ended with reminders about the power of prayer and positive thinking, as if my faith and attitude were the determining factors in Michael's recovery, rather than medical science and hard work. The weight of these collective expectations became crushing as weeks turned into months. Every decision was scrutinized through the lens of maternal adequacy, and any choice that prioritized my own needs or well-being was automatically suspect. I found myself constantly justifying basic acts of self-care, explaining why I needed time to exercise, see friends, or pursue interests unrelated to Michael's condition. The most insidious aspect of these expectations was how they made me feel grateful for Jessica's presence, not because it was genuinely helpful, but because it allowed me to meet other people's standards for maternal devotion while maintaining some semblance of normal life. Having professional help meant I could work without guilt, sleep without worry, and maintain my responsibilities without appearing to neglect my son. This gratitude made me vulnerable to manipulation because it was based on relief rather than genuine evaluation of the situation's appropriateness. I was so focused on meeting external expectations that I failed to notice when professional boundaries began dissolving and when temporary assistance became permanent intrusion. The community's response to hiring professional help was overwhelmingly positive, which reinforced my belief that I was making the right choice. Friends praised my wisdom in recognizing that Michael needed more care than I could provide alone, and colleagues admired my practical approach to managing a difficult situation. The validation felt wonderful after months of wondering whether I was doing enough, trying enough, or sacrificing enough for my son's recovery. But this community approval came with its own set of expectations about how the caregiving arrangement should function. People assumed that having professional help would solve all our problems and return our lives to normal functioning. They expected rapid improvement in Michael's condition, seamless integration of care services, and visible progress toward independence and recovery. When the reality proved more complex, with ongoing challenges and fluctuating progress, I felt pressure to maintain the facade that everything was working perfectly. Admitting problems with the care arrangement would have meant acknowledging that my solution wasn't as effective as everyone believed, which felt like admitting failure as a mother and decision-maker. The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday afternoon in early May while I was mediating a conflict between two students who had been caught fighting in the hallway. My secretary knocked on the conference room door with an apologetic expression, explaining that there was an urgent call from home that couldn't wait. The principal was covering my afternoon meetings, she assured me, but I needed to take this call immediately. Jessica's voice on the other end of the line carried a level of panic I had never heard from her before, despite all the challenges we had faced during Michael's recovery. She spoke rapidly, her words tumbling over each other as she tried to explain what was happening at home. Michael had experienced what she described as a severe setback, becoming disoriented and agitated after his morning physical therapy session. She had tried all the usual calming techniques, but nothing was working, and she was concerned about his safety. The details Jessica provided were alarming and confusing. She claimed that Michael had become convinced that strangers were in the house, that he couldn't recognize familiar objects in his room, and that he was refusing to take his prescribed medications because he believed they were poison. This behavior was completely unlike anything Michael had experienced since his accident, and it contradicted the steady progress he had been making in recent weeks. My first instinct was to call Michael's doctor, but Jessica insisted that she had already contacted the medical team, and they were recommending increased supervision until the episode passed. She explained that this type of confusion could be a delayed reaction to his brain injury, triggered by stress or changes in his medication absorption. The doctors wanted someone with medical training to monitor him continuously for the next several days to ensure his safety and document any patterns in his behavior. Leaving work in the middle of the day felt impossible with the spring semester in full swing and major disciplinary issues requiring my immediate attention. But Jessica's description of Michael's condition made staying seem equally impossible. She assured me that she could handle the situation professionally, but emphasized that he would need round-the-clock monitoring for his own protection. The implication was clear that leaving him alone, even briefly, could result in injury or worse. When I arrived home 20 minutes later, I found Michael sitting calmly in his usual spot on the living room couch, working on a graphic design project with no signs of the confusion or agitation Jessica had described. He greeted me normally, asked about my day, and seemed genuinely puzzled when I inquired about how he was feeling. There was no indication of disorientation, paranoia, or medication refusal. Jessica quickly explained that Michael's lucid moments had been alternating with periods of confusion throughout the day, and that I had arrived during one of his better phases. She showed me detailed notes she had taken documenting his symptoms, including times when he had seemed frightened, confused about his location, and resistant to care. The documentation looked professional and thorough, exactly what I would expect from someone with medical training responding to a crisis. Over the next several hours, I waited for signs of the concerning behavior Jessica had described, but Michael remained completely normal in his interactions and responses. He ate dinner without difficulty, participated in conversation about current events, and completed his evening therapy exercises with his usual level of cooperation. When I mentioned this to Jessica, she explained that brain injury symptoms could be unpredictable, and that the absence of symptoms during my presence didn't mean the earlier episodes hadn't occurred. The medical team's response to Jessica's reports added credibility to her concerns. Dr. Williams, Michael's physical therapist, called that evening to discuss the documented symptoms and recommended the increased supervision Jessica had suggested. She explained that confusion and agitation could indeed be delayed complications of traumatic brain injury, especially when patients were pushing themselves too hard in therapy or experiencing emotional stress. Insurance representatives were equally supportive of extended supervision, approving additional hours for Jessica's services without the usual lengthy approval process. The speed of this approval seemed to validate the severity of Michael's supposed condition and the appropriateness of Jessica's recommendations. Everyone in the medical system was responding as if this was a legitimate crisis requiring immediate intervention. That night, Jessica insisted on sleeping in the guest room to monitor Michael for any recurring symptoms. She set up a baby monitor system between his room and hers, explaining that she needed to be able to respond quickly if he became confused or tried to leave his bed without assistance. The precautions seemed excessive given what I had observed, but I couldn't argue with professional medical recommendations supported by his entire care team. The next morning brought another urgent call to my office, this time reporting that Michael had experienced a panic attack during his shower and had become convinced that someone was watching him through the bathroom window. Jessica described finding him cowering in the corner of the bathroom, refusing to come out until she had checked every window and door in the house for intruders. She had managed to calm him down, but the episode had lasted over an hour and left him exhausted and fearful. Once again, when I arrived home, Michael appeared completely normal and had no memory of the incident Jessica described. He seemed confused by my obvious concern and assured me that he felt fine, had showered without any problems, and couldn't understand why Jessica thought there had been an issue. The disconnect between Jessica's detailed reports and Michael's own experience was troubling, But medical professionals continued to support the explanation that memory loss and denial were common features of brain injury complications. The pattern continued for the rest of the week, with Jessica reporting increasingly severe symptoms that I never witnessed directly. According to her documentation, Michael was experiencing visual hallucinations, episodes of aggressive behavior, and periods of complete disorientation about his identity and location. Each incident required hours of specialized intervention, and Jessica was becoming exhausted from the constant vigilance needed to keep him safe. Dr. Williams recommended a comprehensive neurological evaluation to determine whether Michael's brain injury was causing these new symptoms, but the earliest appointment available was 3 weeks away. In the meantime, she supported Jessica's recommendation for continuous supervision and suggested that any reduction in care could be dangerous given the unpredictable nature of his condition. The most disturbing incident, according to Jessica's reports, occurred on Friday evening when Michael allegedly became violent during his bedtime routine, throwing his medications across the room and accusing Jessica of trying to harm him. She described having to physically restrain him to prevent injury and documented scratches on her arms that she claimed resulted from his attempts to fight her off. The photographic evidence she provided looked consistent with defensive wounds, and her tearful account of the incident was compelling and detailed. Michael's complete lack of memory about this incident, combined with his obvious affection for Jessica and gratitude for her care, created a cognitive dissonance that was difficult to reconcile. Either he was experiencing serious neurological complications that required immediate medical intervention, or something else was happening that I didn't understand. The medical evidence supported the first explanation, but my instincts were beginning to suggest the second possibility. The weekend brought the most significant disruption when Jessica announced that she had contacted Michael's father to inform him about the recent deterioration in his condition. Robert arrived at our house Sunday afternoon in a state of controlled panic, demanding to know why he hadn't been informed sooner about his son's crisis. Jessica had apparently painted a picture of medical emergency and inadequate supervision that required immediate family intervention. Robert's presence in my home for the first time since our divorce was jarring enough, but his assumption that he should be involved in medical decisions about Michael's care was infuriating. He had contributed minimal financial support and even less emotional presence during the months of recovery, but Jessica's call had suddenly made him an expert on his son's needs and my inadequacies as a caregiver. The confrontation that followed revealed how completely Jessica had positioned herself as the authoritative voice on Michael's condition. She provided Robert with detailed medical reports, symptom documentation, and professional recommendations that painted me as overwhelmed and possibly negligent in my caregiving responsibilities. Her presentation was so thorough and convincing that even I began to question whether I had been minimizing serious symptoms or failing to recognize the severity of Michael's deteriorating condition. Robert's solution was predictably dramatic and self-serving. He suggested that Michael should move to a specialized care facility where professionals could provide the level of supervision and medical intervention that his condition apparently required. Alternatively, he proposed that Michael move in with him and his new wife, where their more flexible schedules would allow for better caregiving coordination. Both suggestions were clearly motivated more by Robert's desire to appear involved and responsible than by genuine concern for Michael's well-being. But Jessica's support for exploring these options was surprising and hurtful. She agreed that Michael's needs had become too complex for in-home care with a single caregiver, and suggested that a more institutional setting might provide better resources for managing his symptoms. The idea that the woman I had hired to support Michael's recovery was now advocating for removing him from our home felt like the ultimate betrayal. Jessica had systematically documented problems that I had never witnessed, convinced medical professionals that Michael needed intensive intervention, and positioned herself as the objective expert whose recommendations should override my maternal instincts and observations. The roots of my fierce protectiveness toward Michael traced back to the early years after my divorce from Robert. when I had to rebuild our family's sense of security and stability from almost nothing. The end of my marriage hadn't just been about two adults growing apart. It had been a complete upheaval that left 8-year-old Amanda and 6-year-old Michael confused, angry, and desperately needing reassurance that their world wouldn't continue, falling apart around them. Robert's departure from our daily lives had been swift and decisive, motivated more by his desire to start fresh with his new girlfriend than by any consideration for how his children would adjust to suddenly losing their father's presence. He moved across town within 2 weeks of our separation, and his visits became increasingly sporadic as he became absorbed in building a new life that seemed to have little room for the complications of his previous family. Those early months of single parenthood had taught me that being Michael's mother meant more than providing food, shelter, and transportation to school events. It meant being his primary source of emotional security, his advocate in every situation, and his proof that at least one parent could be counted on to prioritize his well-being above personal convenience or desire. Michael had struggled more than Amanda with the divorce, partly because of his younger age, and partly because of his naturally sensitive temperament. He was the child who worried about everyone else's feelings, who noticed when adults were stressed or upset, and who somehow felt responsible for fixing problems that were far beyond his control or understanding. The divorce had triggered anxiety in him that manifested as trouble sleeping, difficulty concentrating in school, and a constant need for reassurance that I wouldn't leave him to. Building his confidence back had required years of consistent presence, patient conversations, and proof through my actions that some relationships could be trusted completely. I had turned down job opportunities that would have required travel, declined social invitations that conflicted with his activities, and structured my entire life around being available whenever he needed me. It wasn't sacrifice in the traditional sense because seeing him flourish had been the greatest joy and accomplishment of my adult life. As Michael grew into his teenage years, our bond had deepened into genuine friendship alongside our mother-son relationship. He would talk to me about his fears and dreams, his struggles with school and relationships, and his plans for the future with an openness that I knew was rare between parents and teenagers. Other mothers complained about their children becoming distant and secretive, but Michael continued to seek my advice and value my opinions throughout high school and into his early 20s. When Michael moved into his own apartment after college, the transition had been bittersweet but healthy. He was building independence while maintaining close contact, calling several times a week to share news about his work projects, his relationship with Rebecca, and his growing confidence as an adult. Watching him thrive on his own had been proof that all those years of intentional, devoted parenting had created exactly the outcome I had hoped for: a capable, caring, confident young man ready to build his own life. The car accident had stolen all of that progress in a single devastating moment. Suddenly, my independent, successful son was back to needing help with basic functions, struggling with fear and frustration, and questioning whether he would ever feel capable and confident again. The familiar role of being his primary source of security and encouragement had returned, but this time the stakes felt impossibly higher because the damage was so much more severe. Watching Michael work through the physical and emotional challenges of his recovery had reawakened all my maternal instincts with an intensity that surprised me. Every small victory in his therapy felt like a personal triumph. Every setback felt like a personal failure, and every moment of his pain or frustration felt like a direct assault on my heart. The fierce protectiveness that had helped us navigate his childhood was back in full force, along with the overwhelming responsibility to make everything better somehow. Jessica's arrival had seemed like an answer to prayers I hadn't even known I was praying. Finally, there was someone else who could see Michael's potential beyond his injuries, who could encourage his progress without the emotional baggage of maternal guilt and grief, and who could provide the professional expertise that my love alone couldn't supply. For the first time since the accident, I had felt like Michael's recovery wasn't entirely dependent on my ability to be everything he needed every moment of every day. The relief of sharing caregiving responsibilities had been intoxicating. Coming home to find Michael engaged and optimistic instead of frustrated and depressed had felt like watching him come back to life. Jessica's professional competence had given me permission to step back slightly from the intensity of constant worry and focus on other aspects of my life that had been neglected during the crisis. But this emotional foundation also made me vulnerable to manipulation in ways I hadn't anticipated. My gratitude for Michael's improved mood and progress made me reluctant to question Jessica's methods or boundaries, even when my instincts suggested something wasn't quite right. The fear of disrupting his recovery by changing care arrangements kept me silent when I should have spoken up about concerning behaviors. More significantly, my history of being Michael's primary advocate and protector made it difficult to accept that someone else might have better insights into his needs or more effective strategies for supporting his recovery. Jessica's growing influence over medical decisions and care planning felt like a gradual displacement of my maternal role. But challenging her authority meant risking Michael's continued progress. The emotional complexity deepened when I realized that Michael's attachment to Jessica might be filling needs that went beyond medical care. His relationship with Rebecca had ended just when he most needed emotional support and validation that he was still lovable despite his injuries. Jessica's constant presence and encouragement might have been providing the companionship and acceptance that he couldn't find elsewhere during his recovery. Understanding this possibility made Jessica's behavior even more troubling because it suggested she was aware of Michael's emotional vulnerability and might be exploiting it for her own purposes. A professional caregiver should maintain appropriate boundaries precisely to avoid creating unhealthy dependencies or romantic confusion, but Jessica seemed to be deliberately blurring those lines. My protective instincts were telling me that something was wrong with the entire situation, but my rational mind couldn't identify specific problems that justified removing someone who had been so beneficial to Michael's recovery. The internal conflict was exhausting and confusing, especially when medical professionals continued to support Jessica's recommendations, and Michael himself clearly valued her presence in his life. The history of being Michael's steadfast advocate throughout his childhood gave me confidence that my instincts about his well-being were usually accurate. But the brain injury introduced uncertainty about whether I could still read his needs and responses correctly. Jessica's medical training and professional experience gave her credibility that my maternal intuition couldn't match, even when her reports contradicted my own observations. This emotional foundation had prepared me to fight fiercely for Michael's well-being, but it hadn't prepared me to recognize when fighting meant protecting him from someone who appeared to be helping. The very love and dedication that had made me a good mother during his childhood was now making me vulnerable to someone who understood exactly how to exploit maternal devotion for personal gain. The revelation that changed everything came on a Wednesday morning when I forgot my lesson plans and had to return home unexpectedly during what should have been Jessica's busiest time managing Michael's care routine. I had been driving to school when I realized that the materials for my first period advanced placement literature class were sitting on my kitchen counter, and there was no way to teach effectively without them. Returning home 40 minutes after I had left for work should have meant finding Michael and Jessica in the middle of his morning physical therapy exercises, medication routine, or breakfast preparation. Instead, I discovered something that made my blood run cold, and my understanding of the entire situation shift into sharp, undeniable focus. The house was completely silent when I entered through the front door, using my key as quietly as possible to avoid startling anyone who might be concentrating on therapy activities. I called out a greeting as I headed toward the kitchen, but received no response from either Michael or Jessica. The silence itself wasn't necessarily alarming since they might have been in the middle of exercises that required concentration, but something about the quality of the quiet felt wrong. Michael's bedroom door was closed, which was unusual since he typically preferred to keep it open during the day for better air circulation and easier access. More concerning was the complete absence of any sounds that would indicate therapeutic activities, conversation, or even basic movement within the house. The silence was so complete that I began to worry that something serious had happened, that perhaps Michael had experienced another of the episodes Jessica had been documenting. Moving quietly toward Michael's room, I could hear soft voices speaking, in tones that were intimate rather than professional. The conversation was too muffled to make out specific words, but the rhythm and cadence suggested emotional discussion rather than medical consultation. What I could distinguish was periodic soft laughter and long pauses that felt more romantic than therapeutic. My hand hesitated on Michael's bedroom door handle as I tried to convince myself that I was misinterpreting innocent conversation between patient and caregiver. Perhaps they were discussing his progress, planning therapy goals, or simply enjoying friendly conversation that helped distract from the tedium of medical routines. Professional caregivers were encouraged to build rapport with their patients, and Jessica's ability to connect with Michael had been one of her most valuable qualities. But when I finally opened the door, the scene before me destroyed any possibility of innocent interpretation. Jessica was sitting on the edge of Michael's bed, leaning close to him in a posture that was unmistakably intimate rather than professional. They were holding hands, and Jessica was stroking Michael's hair while speaking to him in the soft, affectionate tone typically reserved for romantic partners. Both of them looked up at my entrance with expressions of surprise and guilt that confirmed immediately that they knew their interaction was inappropriate. Jessica jumped away from Michael as if she had been burned, immediately adopting a professional demeanor and beginning to explain that they had been discussing his therapy goals and emotional adjustment to his injuries. Michael's reaction was even more telling because instead of seeming confused or uncomfortable with Jessica's closeness, he looked disappointed by the interruption and protective of whatever conversation they had been having. His expression suggested that this intimate interaction was not new or unwelcome, but rather a continuation of a relationship that had been developing over weeks or months. The medical documentation that Jessica had been so carefully maintaining suddenly took on an entirely different meaning. All those detailed reports about Michael's symptoms, episodes, and setbacks weren't evidence of professional diligence, but rather a systematic campaign to justify her increased presence and authority in our home. Every documented crisis that required her overnight supervision, every recommendation for extended care, every suggestion that Michael needed protection from stress or change served the purpose of making her indispensable. Understanding flooded through me as I realized that Jessica's manipulation had been far more sophisticated than simple boundary violations or personal comfort issues. She had been deliberately creating a medical narrative that positioned her as essential to Michael's recovery, while simultaneously developing an inappropriate personal relationship with him. The supposed symptoms I had never witnessed weren't failures of my observation, but rather fabrications designed to justify her permanent presence in our lives. The phone calls to my office about medical emergencies, the documentation provided to doctors and insurance companies, the recommendations for increased supervision, and the suggestion that Michael might need institutional care all served to create a crisis that only Jessica could solve. She had made herself simultaneously the problem identifier and the solution provider, ensuring that questioning her judgment meant risking Michael's safety and recovery. Michael's apparent improvement in her presence wasn't evidence of exceptional caregiving, but rather proof that the problems she was documenting didn't actually exist. Of course, he seemed normal and stable when I was around, because there were no symptoms to manage or episodes to prevent. The real relationship developing between them was emotional and romantic rather than medical and professional. The realization that I had been systematically deceived and manipulated felt like a physical blow. Jessica had exploited my desperation to help Michael, my gratitude for his apparent progress, and my trust in medical professionals to create a situation where she could pursue a personal relationship while being paid for professional services. She had used my son's vulnerability and my own maternal anxieties to establish herself permanently in our lives. More disturbing was the recognition that Michael was complicit in this deception, whether consciously or unconsciously. His emotional attachment to Jessica had made him willing to participate in narratives about his condition that justified her presence, even if those narratives weren't entirely accurate. His need for companionship and validation after Rebecca's departure had made him vulnerable to someone who understood exactly how to provide what he was missing. The sophisticated nature of Jessica's manipulation became clear as I considered how perfectly she had anticipated and countered every possible objection to her growing influence. She had documentation to support every claim, medical professionals backing every recommendation, and Michael's own apparent well-being as evidence of her effectiveness. Challenging any aspect of her care would have seemed like prioritizing my own comfort over my son's recovery. Standing in that doorway, watching Jessica scramble to maintain her professional facade while Michael looked at her with obvious romantic attachment, I finally understood that this had never been about providing medical care. This had been about a young woman identifying a vulnerable family situation and systematically exploiting it to create the living arrangement and relationship she wanted. The clarity was both devastating and liberating. Devastating, because it meant accepting that I had been completely fooled by someone I had trusted with my son's well-being, and that my own good intentions had been used against me. Liberating, because it meant the growing unease and instincts I had been suppressing were accurate, and that taking action to protect my family was not only justified, but urgently necessary. The moment of complete understanding came when I realized that Jessica's suggestion about Michael needing institutional care or moving in with his father wasn't about his medical needs, but about eliminating me from the equation entirely. If she could convince everyone that I was inadequate as a caregiver and that Michael needed different living arrangements, she could continue their relationship without the inconvenience of my presence or oversight. Every conversation, every medical report, every recommendation, and every crisis had been carefully orchestrated to achieve this outcome. Jessica hadn't just moved into my master bedroom. She had been systematically working to move me out of my own life and my own role as Michael's mother and primary advocate. The rage that followed this realization was unlike anything I had ever experienced. This woman had violated not just the boundaries of professional caregiving, but the sacred trust between a mother and someone hired to help her child. She had exploited tragedy for personal gain and manipulated medical systems to support her deception. But underneath the anger was a cold, determined clarity about what needed to happen next. Jessica's time in my home, in my bedroom, and in my son's life was over. The only question was how to remove her while protecting Michael from the emotional fallout and ensuring that her departure didn't genuinely harm his recovery progress. The professional documentation she had created could be used against her, if necessary, and her violation of caregiver boundaries was grounds for immediate termination of services. But the personal relationship she had developed with Michael meant that simply firing her might not be sufficient to end her influence over him or her presence in our lives. Standing in that bedroom doorway, I knew that the next conversation would determine whether I could reclaim my home and my role as Michael's mother, or whether Jessica's manipulation had progressed too far to be easily reversed. The moment of clarity had given me the knowledge I needed to act, but the real challenge would be convincing Michael that the woman he had come to depend on was not who she had pretended to be. The weeks following Jessica's arrival had felt like watching a miracle unfold in slow motion. After months of struggling to balance my demanding job at the high school with Michael's intensive care needs, having professional help felt like finally being able to breathe again. The transformation in our daily routine was immediate and profound, touching every aspect of our lives in ways I hadn't anticipated. Jessica's impact on Michael's physical recovery was remarkable from the very beginning. She approached his therapy, exercises with an enthusiasm and creativity that made activities he had previously dreaded become engaging challenges. Where I had struggled to motivate him through painful stretches and repetitive movements, Jessica turned rehabilitation into something that resembled play more than medical treatment. She researched adaptive equipment that made daily tasks easier and more dignified for Michael, ordering specialized utensils that allowed him to eat independently and suggesting furniture arrangements that maximized his mobility throughout the house. Her background in working with younger patients meant she understood the psychological importance of maintaining autonomy and self-respect during recovery, and she consistently found ways to support his independence rather than creating dependency. The most impressive aspect of Jessica's caregiving was her ability to push Michael beyond his comfort zone while maintaining his trust and cooperation. She would challenge him to attempt activities that seemed impossible, breaking complex tasks into manageable steps and celebrating each small achievement as if it were a major victory. Under her guidance, Michael began attempting tasks he had abandoned as hopeless, gradually rebuilding confidence in his physical capabilities. Her knowledge of nutrition and meal planning addressed problems I hadn't even recognized. Michael had been eating poorly since his accident, partly due to medication side effects that suppressed his appetite, and partly because preparing nutritious meals required energy I simply didn't have after full days at work. Jessica transformed our kitchen into a space focused on healing, preparing meals that were both appealing and specifically designed to support his recovery. She researched anti-inflammatory foods that could help with his ongoing pain, prepared protein-rich snacks to support muscle rebuilding, and created smoothies packed with vitamins and minerals that his damaged system needed for optimal healing. The improvement in Michael's energy levels and overall health was visible within weeks, and his doctors commented positively on his improved nutritional status during follow-up appointments. Jessica's professional connections proved invaluable in navigating the complex world of rehabilitation services and medical equipment. She knew which physical therapists in town had the best reputations for working with traumatic brain injury patients, which medical supply companies offered the most cost-effective equipment rentals, and which insurance representatives were most helpful in approving necessary services. Through her network, we gained access to resources that would have taken me months to discover on my own. Her concerns seemed to focus more on propriety than practicality, which frustrated me given how beneficial Jessica's presence had been for Michael's recovery. The conversation began innocently enough, with family members asking about Michael's progress and expressing pleasure at hearing about his improved mood and renewed interest in future plans. Everyone was genuinely happy to learn that he was working on graphic design projects again and considering the possibility of returning to part-time employment within the next few months. But when I mentioned Jessica's role in facilitating these improvements, the atmosphere in Karen's dining room shifted noticeably. My Aunt Patricia, who had strong opinions about most family matters despite limited direct involvement in our lives, raised her eyebrows in a way that clearly indicated disapproval even before she spoke. Patricia's concerns centered on what she characterized as inappropriate blurring of professional boundaries. She questioned whether it was proper for a young female caregiver to be living in the same house as a single male patient, especially when that arrangement involved sleeping in the family home on a regular basis. Her implications about potential impropriety were veiled but unmistakable. Karen supported Patricia's concerns by sharing stories she had heard from friends about home healthcare workers who had taken advantage of vulnerable families. She spoke about cases where caregivers had stolen from clients, formed inappropriate relationships with patients, or created unnecessary dependency to ensure continued employment. While she insisted she wasn't suggesting Jessica was guilty of any misconduct, her warnings carried clear implications about the risks I might be overlooking. My cousin David joined the conversation with questions about the financial implications of extended home care services. He wondered whether insurance companies might eventually question the medical necessity of round-the-clock supervision for someone who was making significant progress in his recovery. His concerns about potential billing issues or accusations of insurance fraud felt like attacks on decisions I had made based on professional medical recommendations. The most painful criticism came from my own mother, who had been largely supportive throughout Michael's recovery, but now expressed worry about what she called my over-reliance on outside help. She suggested that having a stranger living in my home might be preventing Michael from developing the independence that should be the ultimate goal of his rehabilitation. Her comments stung because they implied that my gratitude for Jessica's help reflected weakness or inadequacy as a mother rather than recognition of professional expertise that was genuinely beneficial. The suggestion that I was somehow failing Michael by accepting help felt like a betrayal, especially from someone whose support had been crucial during the darkest months of his recovery. Robert's unexpected arrival at Karen's house midway through dinner added another layer of complexity to the family discussion. He had been invited by Karen, who thought his input as Michael's father might be valuable in addressing concerns about our current care arrangements. His presence felt like an ambush, particularly since he hadn't shown significant interest in Michael's day-to-day care decisions throughout the recovery process. Robert's perspective on Jessica's role was predictably critical and self-serving. He expressed surprise that I had made such significant decisions about Michael's care without consulting him, despite the fact that he had been largely absent from medical appointments and care planning since Michael left the hospital. His sudden interest in parental authority felt opportunistic rather than genuine. He questioned whether Jessica's presence might be hindering Michael's emotional recovery by providing too much support and comfort during a time when he needed to develop resilience and independence. Robert suggested that Michael might be becoming too dependent on Jessica's assistance and encouragement, potentially delaying his psychological adjustment to his new physical limitations. The irony of receiving advice about parental involvement from someone who had contributed minimal time, energy, or financial support to Michael's recovery was not lost on me, but pointing out this hypocrisy would only have escalated the conflict. Instead, I found myself defending decisions that had seemed obviously beneficial just hours before. The family's collective concern seemed to focus on the unusual nature of our arrangement rather than its effectiveness. They acknowledged that Michael was improving dramatically and that I seemed less stressed and overwhelmed than I had been in months, but they worried about social perceptions and long-term implications of such an unconventional caregiving situation. Karen's questions about my neighbors' reactions revealed concerns about community gossip and judgment. She wondered whether people might misinterpret Jessica's frequent presence in our home, especially given her age and the fact that she sometimes stayed overnight. The suggestion that I should be worried about protecting my reputation felt frustrating, when my primary concern was protecting Michael's recovery. Patricia's comments about maintaining appropriate boundaries reflected generational differences in attitudes toward professional healthcare relationships. She came from an era when medical care was more formal and hierarchical, and the collaborative, personalized approach that Jessica brought to Michael's treatment seemed inappropriate to her traditional sensibilities. The discussion revealed how differently various family members understood Michael's current needs and prognosis. Some relatives seemed to believe that he should be much further along in his recovery by now, while others worried that he might never regain full independence. These different expectations led to conflicting opinions about whether Jessica's intensive support was helpful or potentially harmful. David's financial concerns reflected broader family anxiety about the sustainability of our current arrangements. He worried that insurance coverage might be reduced or eliminated if Michael's condition continued to improve, leaving us responsible for significant out-of-pocket expenses for services that had become integral to our daily functioning. The most difficult aspect of the family discussion was the way it forced me to articulate and defend the emotional benefits of Jessica's presence, which were harder to quantify than her professional qualifications, but equally important to Michael's recovery. Explaining how her optimism and encouragement had helped rebuild his confidence felt too personal and vulnerable to share with relatives who seemed focused on potential problems rather than obvious improvements. Robert's suggestion that Michael might benefit from male caregivers or mentors instead of a young female nurse revealed his own discomfort with the gender dynamics of our arrangement. He implied that Michael's attachment to Jessica might be delaying his adjustment to post-accident relationships and preventing him from developing age-appropriate social connections. The family's concerns culminated in a series of suggestions for alternative care arrangements that would address their worries while supposedly maintaining the benefits Michael had experienced. These ranged from switching to male caregivers to reducing Jessica's hours to moving Michael into a rehabilitation facility where professional oversight would prevent any potential boundary violations. Each suggested alternative felt like a step backward from the progress we had achieved, and defending the status quo against family pressure proved emotionally exhausting. The dinner that had been intended as a supportive family gathering became an interrogation of my judgment and decision-making abilities. The most frustrating aspect of the entire conversation was the way family members' concerns seemed to prioritize abstract principles and social conventions over Michael's obvious improvement and well-being. She arranged for a consultation with an occupational therapist who specialized in cognitive rehabilitation, connected us with a support group for young adults recovering from accidents, and found a driving instructor who worked specifically with people adapting to physical limitations. The social isolation that had been one of the most difficult aspects of Michael's recovery began to lift as Jessica encouraged him to reconnect with friends and interests that had been neglected during his darkest months. She helped him set up video calls with college friends who lived in other cities, organized his workspace so he could return to freelance graphic design projects, and even researched adaptive sports programs that might allow him to participate in activities he had enjoyed before his accident. Her approach to managing Michael's emotional health was equally impressive. She recognized that his depression and anxiety weren't just understandable reactions to trauma, but potentially serious obstacles to physical recovery. Instead of simply accepting his dark moods as inevitable, she worked consistently to identify triggers for his emotional struggles and develop strategies for managing them effectively. Jessica introduced relaxation techniques that helped Michael manage chronic pain without relying solely on medication, taught him breathing exercises that reduced anxiety during challenging therapy sessions, and created structured routines that provided stability and predictability during a time when everything else felt uncertain. Her calm, optimistic presence seemed to give him permission to hope again. The financial benefits of having Jessica's services covered by insurance felt like an unexpected gift during a time when medical expenses were overwhelming our family budget. Her documentation of Michael's needs was so thorough and professional that insurance approvals came through quickly and without the usual bureaucratic challenges that had plagued other aspects of his care. She maintained detailed records of his progress, symptom patterns, and response to various treatments that impressed medical professionals and supported requests for additional services or equipment. Her ability to communicate effectively with doctors, insurance representatives, and other healthcare providers meant that I could focus on my own responsibilities while trusting that Michael's medical needs were being expertly managed. The improvement in my own quality of life during those first weeks was almost as dramatic as Michael's progress. For the first time since his accident, I could go to work without constantly worrying about his safety, emotional state, or physical needs. Knowing that someone competent and caring was with him allowed me to concentrate on my job responsibilities and even begin to rebuild social connections that had been neglected during the crisis. My friends at work commented on how much more relaxed and energetic I seemed, and I began accepting invitations to social events that I had been declining for months. The chronic exhaustion that had been my constant companion started to lift as I finally felt secure enough to sleep soundly through the night, knowing that Michael would receive appropriate care if he needed assistance. Jessica's presence also allowed me to resume activities that were important for my own physical and mental health. I started going to the gym again, joined a book club that met monthly at the local library, and even went on a weekend trip to visit my sister in Columbus. For the first time since Michael's accident, these small returns to normalcy felt revolutionary after months of complete focus on caregiving responsibilities. The house itself seemed to come alive again with Jessica's influence. She brought energy and optimism that had been missing since Michael came home from the hospital, filling rooms with conversation, laughter, and music that created an atmosphere of healing rather than mere survival. Her presence made the space feel like a home rather than a medical facility. She decorated Michael's room with motivational posters and photographs that emphasized hope and recovery. reorganized common areas to be more functional and welcoming, and even maintained the gardens that I had been neglecting. The physical environment began to reflect the emotional transformation happening within our family. Jessica's relationship with Michael appeared to be the perfect balance of professional competence and personal warmth. She maintained appropriate boundaries while clearly caring about his well-being as an individual rather than just a patient. Her ability to find the right tone in their interactions, being supportive without being condescending and encouraging, without being unrealistic, seemed to give Michael exactly what he needed during his recovery. The trust between them developed naturally as Michael experienced Jessica's consistent reliability and genuine investment in his progress. She never made promises she couldn't keep, never minimized his struggles or concerns, and never pushed him beyond what was medically appropriate. Her professional integrity seemed unquestionable, and her positive impact on his life was undeniable. Community response to our arrangement was overwhelmingly positive, with neighbors and friends expressing admiration for our practical approach to managing Michael's care needs. People praised my wisdom in recognizing the importance of professional help and frequently commented on how much better both Michael and I seemed since Jessica had joined our household. The success of our arrangement became a source of inspiration for other families dealing with similar challenges. Sarah Chen connected me with several parents who were struggling to balance caregiving responsibilities with work obligations, and I found myself recommending Jessica's agency and sharing strategies that had worked well for our family. Local medical professionals began referring other families to Golden Care Home Health Agency, specifically because of the positive outcomes they had observed in Michael's case. Dr. Williams mentioned our situation as an example of how appropriate professional support could dramatically accelerate recovery and improve quality of life for entire families affected by traumatic injuries. The sense of hope that had been missing from our lives since Michael's accident finally returned as we began to envision a future where his recovery would be complete and our family would emerge from this crisis stronger than before. Jessica's expertise and dedication seemed to be the missing piece that would make this positive outcome possible. Jessica's integration into our daily routines felt seamless and natural, as if she had always been part of our family rather than a recent addition. Her ability to anticipate needs, solve problems before they became serious issues, and maintain a positive atmosphere even during difficult days made her presence feel like a blessing rather than a professional service. The gratitude I felt for Jessica's impact on Michael's life was profound and genuine. Watching my son rediscover hope, rebuild confidence, and begin planning for his future felt like witnessing a resurrection. After months of fearing that the vibrant, optimistic young man I had raised might be lost forever, Jessica seemed to be helping him find his way back to himself. The first signs of family concern about our new arrangements came during a routine Sunday dinner at my sister Karen's house in the suburbs, where our extended family had been gathering monthly since before Michael's accident. These dinners had been a source of stability and connection throughout the challenges of the past year, but this particular evening introduced tensions that I hadn't anticipated and wasn't prepared to navigate. Karen had been asking pointed questions about Jessica's role in our household ever since learning that she was staying overnight several times a week. During our phone conversations leading up to the dinner, Karen's tone had carried a subtle disapproval that made me defensive about decisions I had felt confident about just days before. Their focus on potential problems felt premature and unnecessarily pessimistic, given the positive outcomes we were experiencing. Driving home from Karen's house that evening, I felt confused and defensive about arrangements that had seemed unquestionably beneficial just hours before. The family's concerns planted seeds of doubt about Jessica's motivations and the appropriateness of our current situation, even though nothing about her behavior or Michael's progress suggested any actual problems. The conflict between family pressure and my own observations of Michael's improvement would prove to be just the beginning of more serious challenges to come. The doubts raised during that Sunday dinner conversation would grow larger in the weeks ahead, even as Jessica's positive impact on Michael's life continued to be undeniable. The whispers started at the grocery store on a Thursday afternoon when I ran into Diane Morrison, whose daughter had graduated from Riverside High School 3D. Years earlier, Diane had always been friendly during our brief encounters around town, usually asking about my work at the school or sharing updates about her daughter's college experiences. This conversation took a distinctly different tone that left me feeling exposed and defensive about aspects of my life I had never considered controversial. Diane's approach was casual but pointed, beginning with standard pleasantries about the weather and the upcoming spring concert at the high school before transitioning to more personal territory. She mentioned hearing from mutual friends that I had been dealing with Michael's recovery challenges and expressed sympathy for how difficult the situation must be for our family. Her tone shifted noticeably when she brought up what she described as rumors circulating through our neighborhood about my household arrangements. According to Diane, several people had noticed a young woman coming and going from my house at unusual hours, sometimes staying overnight and appearing to have moved personal belongings into the residence. The way Diane presented this information made it clear that these observations had been the subject of discussion among neighbors, though she claimed the conversations were motivated by concern rather than judgment. She assured me that people were worried about my well-being and wanted to make sure I wasn't being taken advantage of during a vulnerable time. Diane's questions about Jessica's qualifications and background felt like barely concealed accusations about my judgment in hiring caregiving help. She wondered aloud whether I had conducted thorough background checks, verified professional credentials, and established clear boundaries about the scope of services being provided. Her suggestion that some community members were concerned about the appropriateness of having a young, attractive woman living in my home with my adult son carried implications that made my stomach clench with anger and embarrassment. The insinuation that Michael and Jessica's professional relationship might have developed into something inappropriate felt like a violation of both their dignity and my own reputation as a responsible mother. The most hurtful aspect of Diane's comments was her suggestion that other parents were questioning my decision-making abilities and wondering whether Michael's accident had somehow impaired my judgment about his care needs. The implication that I was being naive or overly trusting felt like a direct attack on my competence as both a mother and a professional. Diane's parting comment about hoping that everything worked out well for our family carried a tone of pity. That was almost worse than outright criticism. Her assurance that she would defend my character if anyone questioned my motives felt like confirmation that such discussions were already taking place throughout our community. The encounter left me shaken and self-conscious about appearances I had never considered problematic. Walking through the grocery store after talking with Diane, I felt like other shoppers were watching me with newfound interest, evaluating my choices and drawing conclusions about my family situation based on incomplete information and neighborhood gossip. That evening's phone call from Sarah Chen confirmed that community discussion about my household arrangements was more widespread than I had realized. Sarah had been approached by several mutual friends who expressed concern about stories they had heard regarding Jessica's role in Michael's care and her apparent permanent residence in my home. Sarah's loyalty and friendship meant that she had defended my decisions and praised Jessica's positive impact on Michael's recovery, but she felt obligated to warn me about the growing speculation and judgment that was circulating through various social circles. Her description of the conversations made it clear that some people were interpreting Jessica's presence as evidence of poor judgment, inappropriate boundaries, or worse. The most damaging rumors, according to Sarah, suggested that I was either being manipulated by a cunning caregiver who was taking advantage of my desperation, or that I was deliberately ignoring obvious signs of an inappropriate relationship between Jessica and Michael because I was afraid to disrupt his recovery progress. Some community members apparently believed that Jessica was exploiting our family's vulnerability to create a comfortable living situation for herself while providing minimal actual caregiving services. Others speculated that she was positioning herself to inherit or gain access to our family's financial resources through manipulation and emotional exploitation. The most painful rumors suggested that I was failing in my responsibilities as Michael's mother by allowing a stranger to take over caregiving duties that should have remained within the family. These criticisms painted my decision to hire professional help as evidence of selfishness or unwillingness to make necessary personal sacrifices for my son's well-being. Sarah's account of defending our arrangements to these critics revealed how difficult it was to explain the nuanced benefits of Jessica's presence to people who were predisposed to see problems. The emotional support, professional expertise, and dramatic improvements in Michael's condition seemed less important to gossips than the unusual living arrangement and potential for scandal. The impact of community judgment extended beyond personal embarrassment to professional concerns about my reputation at Riverside High School. As vice principal, I was expected to maintain standards of conduct and judgment that reflected well on the school district, and rumors about questionable decision-making in my personal life could potentially affect my professional standing. Principal Martinez's casual mention during a staff meeting that he had heard I was dealing with some family challenges felt like a warning that workplace discussions about my situation were beginning to occur. His assurance that the school administration supported staff members during difficult personal times carried an undertone suggesting that support might be conditional on maintaining appropriate conduct. The most frustrating aspect of the social judgment was how it forced me to defend decisions that had been made based on Michael's medical needs and professional recommendations. The community's focus on appearances and conventional expectations seemed to completely ignore the measurable improvements in his physical and emotional condition since Jessica had become involved in his care. Attending the monthly school board meeting became an exercise in self-consciousness, as I wondered which community members had heard rumors about my household arrangements and what conclusions they had drawn about my character and judgment. The professional relationships that had been comfortable and collegial for years suddenly felt strained by unspoken questions and concerns. The social pressure intensified when several parents who had children in the high school began making pointed comments about the importance of adult role models maintaining appropriate boundaries and demonstrating good judgment in their personal lives. These comments were ostensibly about general principles of professional conduct, but their timing and context made their relevance to my situation unmistakable. Church attendance, which had been a source of comfort and community support throughout Michael's recovery, became another venue for uncomfortable conversations and judgmental observations. Well-meaning congregants who offered to pray for our family situation often included requests for wisdom and guidance that implied I was making questionable choices that required divine intervention. The erosion of social support during a time when I most needed community understanding felt like a secondary trauma that complicated an already challenging situation. The energy required to defend and explain my decisions to people who seemed determined to find fault left me emotionally exhausted and increasingly isolated. The irony of facing social judgment for arrangements that had been medically recommended and professionally supervised was not lost on me, but pointing out this contradiction only seemed to fuel additional speculation about my ability to accurately assess professional advice and make appropriate decisions about Michael's care. The community's focus on potential scandals and inappropriate relationships completely overshadowed the remarkable progress Michael had made and the relief I had experienced from having competent help during his recovery. The success of our arrangements seemed irrelevant to people who were more interested in conformity than effectiveness. The social pressure reached a crescendo when anonymous notes began appearing in my mailbox, expressing concern about the situation and suggesting that I seek guidance from clergy, counselors, or other family members about appropriate boundaries and decision-making. These messages, while claiming to be motivated by caring concern, felt like threats and intimidation from neighbors who lacked the courage to address their concerns directly. The realization that my personal life had become a source of entertainment and judgment for people throughout the community was devastating and isolating. The support system that had been crucial during the early months of Michael's recovery was being undermined by gossip and speculation that prioritized social conventions over genuine concern for our family's well-being. The ambush came on a Saturday morning when I thought I was attending a casual coffee meeting with my sister Karen and our mutual friend Ellen Richards, to discuss plans for our mother's upcoming 70th birthday celebration. Instead, I walked into what had clearly been orchestrated as an intervention designed to force me to reconsider Jessica's role in Michael's care and our family's current living arrangements. The first indication that this was not a normal social gathering was the presence of Dr. Patricia Williams, Michael's physical therapist, who Karen claimed had happened to run into them at the coffee shop and joined their conversation. The coincidence seemed implausible given that Dr. Williams typically spent Saturday mornings with her own family and had never shown interest in socializing with my relatives outside of professional contexts. Karen's opening comments revealed the true purpose of the meeting when she announced that several people who cared about Michael and me had become concerned about our current situation and wanted to discuss alternative approaches to his ongoing care needs. The phrasing made it clear that this was a coordinated effort rather than spontaneous concern from individual family members. Dr. Williams's participation gave the intervention medical credibility that made their concerns more difficult to dismiss as mere social judgment or family interference. She explained that while Michael's physical progress had been excellent, some aspects of his current care arrangement raised questions about long-term independence goals and appropriate therapeutic boundaries. Her professional assessment suggested that Michael might be developing an unhealthy dependency on Jessica's constant presence and emotional support, which could potentially hinder his psychological adjustment to living with permanent physical limitations. Dr. Williams worried that the intensive one-on-one attention he was receiving might be preventing him from developing coping strategies that would be necessary when professional caregiving services eventually ended. Ellen's contribution to the discussion focused on practical concerns about financial sustainability and insurance coverage. As someone who worked in healthcare administration, she had researched typical coverage patterns for home health services and discovered that extended residential care was usually approved only for patients with more severe dependencies than Michael currently demonstrated. Her investigation had revealed that insurance companies might begin questioning the medical necessity of round-the-clock supervision for someone who was mobile, cognitively intact, and capable of performing most daily living activities independently. Ellen worried that we might face sudden termination of coverage that would leave us responsible for significant out-of-pocket expenses or force abrupt changes in care arrangements. Karen's concerns centered on what she characterized as inappropriate blurring of professional and personal boundaries that could ultimately harm both Michael and Jessica. She had researched professional standards for home healthcare workers and discovered that many agencies prohibited employees from developing close personal relationships with clients or their families. Her investigation suggested that Jessica's level of involvement in our household management and decision-making exceeded typical caregiver responsibilities and might violate professional ethics guidelines. Karen worried that if these boundary violations came to the attention of Jessica's employing agency or state licensing boards, both Jessica and our family could face serious consequences. The most disturbing revelation came when Dr. Williams shared concerns that had been raised by other members of Michael's medical team during recent case conferences. Several professionals had noted changes in his behavior and attitude that suggested possible romantic or emotional attachment to his caregiver, which could complicate his recovery and create ethical dilemmas for continued treatment. According to Dr. Williams, Michael had begun referring to Jessica in ways that suggested their relationship had moved beyond professional caregiving into personal territory. He spoke about her opinions and preferences in contexts that seemed inappropriate for a patient-provider relationship, and he had expressed anxiety about the possibility of her services being reduced or terminated. Ellen's research had uncovered legal precedents where families had faced accusations of enabling inappropriate relationships between caregivers and vulnerable adults, particularly in cases involving young patients recovering from traumatic injuries. She worried that our family could become liable for failing to maintain appropriate supervision and boundaries if Jessica's behavior crossed professional lines. The intervention team had prepared alternative solutions that they believed would address their concerns while maintaining the benefits of professional support for Michael's continued recovery. Their proposals had been researched and coordinated to address various aspects of the situation they found problematic. Dr. Williams recommended transitioning to outpatient therapy services that would provide intensive rehabilitation support without requiring residential caregiving arrangements. She suggested that Michael had progressed sufficiently to benefit from group therapy sessions and community-based programs that would encourage independence while maintaining professional oversight. Karen's alternative involved hiring multiple part-time caregivers who would provide necessary support without developing the intensive personal relationships that concerned the intervention team. She had contacted several agencies that specialized in rotating staff assignments specifically to prevent the kind of boundary issues they believed were developing with Jessica. Ellen's financial planning focused on maximizing insurance coverage for approved services while minimizing out-of-pocket expenses that might become unsustainable if coverage was reduced or terminated. She had identified community resources and support programs that could supplement professional services at reduced cost. The coordination of their presentation was impressive and overwhelming, addressing every aspect of our current situation with professional expertise and carefully researched alternatives. Their united front made it difficult to argue against their recommendations without appearing stubborn or unreasonable. The most effective aspect of their intervention was how they positioned their concerns as protective of both Michael and me, rather than critical of decisions I had made. They insisted that their goal was preventing future problems rather than addressing current failures, which made their suggestions seem caring rather than judgmental. Dr. Williams' professional authority was particularly persuasive because she had been involved in Michael's care since the early days of his recovery and had consistently supported our family through the most challenging aspects of his rehabilitation. Her endorsement of concerns about Jessica's role carried weight that made dismissing the intervention seem medically irresponsible. The financial arguments were equally compelling because they addressed realistic concerns about the sustainability of current arrangements, regardless of their effectiveness. Even if Jessica's presence was beneficial, the possibility of sudden coverage termination could create chaos that would ultimately harm Michael's progress. Karen's research into professional standards provided a framework for understanding that their concerns were based on established guidelines rather than personal opinions or social conventions. The possibility that Jessica might be violating professional ethics unintentionally made it seem necessary to address the situation proactively. The intervention concluded with a timeline for implementing their recommended changes that would allow for gradual transition rather than abrupt disruption of services that Michael had come to depend on. Their careful planning demonstrated genuine concern for his well-being while addressing the problems they had identified. The pressure to accept their recommendations was intense because rejecting their coordinated professional advice would mean taking full responsibility for any negative consequences that might result from continuing current arrangements. The intervention had effectively shifted the burden of proof to require me to justify maintaining the status quo, rather than them having to prove problems existed. Leaving the coffee shop that morning, I felt manipulated and cornered by people who claimed to have my family's best interests at heart, but had chosen to ambush me with coordinated pressure rather than engage in honest conversation about their concerns. The intervention had been designed to overwhelm my ability to defend decisions that had been working well for Michael and our family. The sophisticated nature of their opposition made it clear that casual resistance would not be sufficient to maintain our current arrangements. They had prepared professional, financial, and legal arguments that would require equally thorough responses to counter effectively. The battle for control over Michael's care had moved beyond family disagreement into coordinated campaign territory. The confrontation that would determine the future of our family came on a Monday evening when I returned home from what had been the most stressful day of my professional career. The spring semester was reaching its peak intensity with graduation, preparations, senior project presentations, and the endless administrative tasks that came with managing a high school of nearly 800 students. I had spent 12 hours dealing with disciplinary issues, parent conferences, and budget meetings. looking forward to the peace and normalcy that home usually provided. Instead, I walked into what felt like a hostile takeover of my own house. Robert was sitting at my kitchen table with a stack of legal documents spread before him, while Jessica stood beside the counter wearing an expression that mixed defiance with false concern. The sight of my ex-husband in my home without invitation or advance notice was jarring enough, but the obvious coordination between him and Jessica felt like a betrayal that cut deeper than anything I could have imagined. Robert's opening statement revealed the scope of the conspiracy that had been developing behind my back for weeks. He announced that he had been consulting with medical professionals, legal advisors, and family court experts about Michael's current care situation, and had concluded that immediate changes were necessary to protect both Michael's recovery and our family's legal standing. The legal documents spread across my kitchen table represented a formal petition for modification of custody arrangements that would give Robert equal decision-making authority over Michael's medical care and living situation. Despite being absent from the daily realities of caregiving for months, Robert was now claiming that my judgment about Michael's needs had become compromised, and that co-parental oversight was necessary to ensure appropriate care decisions. Jessica's role in supporting Robert's legal challenge became clear as she presented a detailed report documenting concerns about Michael's current living situation and care arrangements. Her professional credentials gave weight to observations that painted me as overwhelmed, emotionally compromised, and unable to maintain appropriate boundaries with caregiving staff. According to Jessica's documentation, Michael had expressed concern about my stress levels and my ability to manage his care needs while maintaining my demanding job responsibilities. She claimed that he had confided in her about feeling guilty for being a burden on my life, and worried that I was sacrificing my own well-being to provide care that might be better managed through alternative arrangements. The most devastating aspect of Jessica's report was her assertion that Michael had begun discussing his preference for living arrangements that would provide more comprehensive professional support, while allowing me to focus on my career and personal needs. She presented this as evidence of his maturity and consideration for my well-being, when it was clearly a manipulation designed to justify removing him from my care. Robert's legal strategy was sophisticated and emotionally manipulative, positioning himself as the concerned father who was intervening to protect both his son and his ex-wife from a situation that had become unmanageable. He presented himself as the objective parent who could evaluate Michael's needs without the emotional complications that allegedly clouded my judgment. The proposed alternative living arrangement involved Michael moving to a specialized residential facility that Robert had researched and pre-approved through insurance channels. This facility would provide round-the-clock professional care while allowing Michael to continue his rehabilitation and eventual transition to independent living. Jessica's endorsement of this plan carried professional weight that made opposing it seem like prioritizing my own attachment to caregiving over Michael's actual needs. She argued that residential care would provide Michael with peer support, professional diversity, and independence training that couldn't be replicated in a family home setting. The legal documentation included statements from several medical professionals who had been contacted by Robert and asked to provide opinions about appropriate care levels for someone with Michael's current functional status. These professionals, who had limited direct experience with Michael's daily needs and progress, had provided general recommendations that supported reduced family caregiving and increased professional oversight. Robert's timeline for implementing these changes was aggressive and clearly designed to prevent me from mounting effective opposition. He wanted Michael to begin transitioning to the residential facility within 2 weeks, claiming that delays would only make the adjustment more difficult and potentially compromise his continued recovery progress. The financial arguments supporting Robert's plan were compelling and frightening. He had discovered that insurance coverage for extended home health services was indeed under review, and that continued approval was uncertain given Michael's improved functional status. The residential facility he had chosen would be fully covered by insurance and would eliminate the financial risk of sudden coverage termination. Jessica's support for Robert's plan revealed the depth of her manipulation, and the extent to which she had been working against our family's interests while pretending to serve them. Her betrayal felt more devastating than Robert's legal maneuvering, because I had trusted her with my son's care and my family's well-being. The realization that Jessica had been documenting evidence to support Robert's custody challenge while accepting payment for caregiving services felt like professional fraud of the most personal and damaging kind. She had violated every principle of professional ethics while positioning herself as the expert whose recommendations should guide Michael's future. Michael's absence from this confrontation was the most telling aspect of the entire situation. According to Robert and Jessica, he was attending an evening therapy session that had been scheduled specifically to allow them to present their plan without his emotional involvement complicating the discussion. The coordination required to arrange Michael's absence while orchestrating this legal ambush demonstrated how thoroughly Robert and Jessica had planned their campaign to remove Michael from my care. They had manipulated schedules, appointments, and information to create the perfect opportunity for maximum pressure and minimum resistance. Robert's insistence that this plan was in everyone's best interests, including mine, felt like gaslighting, designed to make me question my own perceptions and motivations. He claimed that I would be relieved to have the burden of caregiving responsibilities removed and free to focus on my career and personal life without guilt or stress. The suggestion that I should be grateful for this intervention rather than threatened by it revealed Robert's complete misunderstanding of my relationship with Michael and my commitment to his recovery. His inability to comprehend that caregiving had been a privilege rather than a burden showed how fundamentally he misunderstood both parenthood and love. Jessica's assertion that she would be willing to continue providing care for Michael in the residential facility setting felt like the final insult in a series of professional and personal betrayals. She was positioning herself to maintain her relationship with Michael while removing me from any meaningful role in his life and recovery. The legal pressure Robert was applying through his custody modification petition created a timeline for decision-making that was clearly designed to prevent careful consideration of alternatives or consultation with independent advisors. He wanted a commitment to his plan that evening, claiming that delays would only make the necessary changes more traumatic for Michael. The threat implicit in Robert's legal action was that rejecting his plan would result in a public custody battle that would expose our family's private struggles to court scrutiny and community judgment. He was using the potential for embarrassment and legal costs as leverage to force acceptance of arrangements that served his interests rather than Michael's needs. Standing in my own kitchen, facing the coordinated opposition of my ex-husband and the woman I had trusted to help my son recover, I realized that this moment would determine whether I could maintain my role as Michael's primary advocate and caregiver, or whether I would be legally and practically forced to surrender control over his life to people whose motivations were questionable at best. The choice between fighting a legal battle that could drain our family's resources and expose our private struggles to public scrutiny, or accepting arrangements that removed Michael from my daily care, felt impossible. Both options seemed to sacrifice important aspects of our family's well-being and Michael's continued recovery. But looking at the legal documents spread across my kitchen table and seeing the satisfied expressions on Robert and Jessica's faces as they waited for my capitulation, I realized that this was never really about Michael's medical needs or optimal care arrangements. This was about power, control, and the systematic manipulation of a vulnerable family situation for personal gain. The clarity that came with recognizing the true nature of this confrontation gave me the strength to make the most difficult decision of my life as a mother. Sometimes protecting your child means fighting battles that seem impossible to win, and sometimes love requires courage that feels beyond your capacity to summon. Mrs. Eleanor Hayes lived in the house directly across the street from mine, and in the 43 years since her husband's death, she had become the unofficial neighborhood historian and source of practical wisdom for families facing difficult decisions. At 73 years old, she had witnessed countless domestic dramas, medical crises, and family conflicts from her front porch vantage point, and her insights were usually more valuable than any professional advice money could buy. I found myself knocking on Mrs. Hayes's front door at 9 o'clock that same Monday evening, still shaking from the confrontation with Robert and Jessica, but desperate for perspective from someone who had no agenda other than genuine concern for my family's well-being. Mrs. Hayes answered the door in her familiar blue robe and slippers, took one look at my face, and immediately ushered me into her warm kitchen where she had been preparing her evening tea. Without being asked, Mrs. Hayes poured a second cup of chamomile tea and settled into the chair across from me at her small wooden table that had been the site of countless neighborhood conversations over the decades. Her gentle but direct manner had always made it easy to confide in her, and that evening I found myself pouring out the entire story of Jessica's arrival, the manipulation I had discovered, and the legal confrontation that had just occurred in my own home. Mrs. Hayes listened without interruption as I described the progression from grateful relief at finding competent help for Michael's care to the devastating realization that Jessica had been systematically manipulating our family situation for her own purposes. Her expression remained calm and thoughtful throughout my emotional recounting, but I could see recognition and understanding in her eyes that suggested my experience was not entirely unique. When I finished describing Robert's legal threats and Jessica's betrayal, Mrs. Hayes was quiet for several minutes, sipping her tea and looking out her kitchen window toward my house, where lights were still burning in what had once felt like a sanctuary, but now felt like occupied territory. Her eventual response began with a story that I had never heard, despite our years of neighborhood friendship. Mrs. Hayes told me about her own experience 40 years earlier, when her husband had suffered a massive stroke that left him partially paralyzed and requiring extensive care during his final 2 years of life. Like me, she had initially been overwhelmed by the complexity of managing his medical needs while maintaining her job as a school secretary and caring for their teenage daughter who was struggling with her father's condition. The home health aide who had been assigned to her husband's care had seemed like a blessing during those first difficult months. Patricia, who was in her 20s and recently certified, had brought energy and optimism to their home while providing competent medical support that allowed Mrs. Hayes to continue working and maintain some semblance of normal family life. But gradually, Patricia had begun inserting herself into family decisions and household management in ways that went far beyond her professional responsibilities. She had offered opinions about financial planning, suggested changes to household routines that she claimed would be better for her patient's recovery, and slowly positioned herself as indispensable to the family's functioning. The most concerning development had been Patricia's growing influence over Mrs. Hayes's husband, who had become emotionally dependent on her constant presence and validation. Patricia had encouraged this dependency by suggesting that Mrs. Hayes was too emotionally involved to make objective decisions about his care, and that his recovery required the kind of professional distance that only she could provide. Mrs. Hayes described the gradual erosion of her own authority in her home, as Patricia took over more responsibilities and decision-making power, always with explanations about medical necessity and professional expertise that made opposition seem selfish or medically irresponsible. The situation had reached crisis proportions when Patricia began suggesting that Mrs. Hayes's husband might recover more effectively in a care facility where professional supervision would be available around the clock. The turning point had come when Mrs. Hayes discovered that Patricia had been encouraging her husband to change his will to include provisions for her continued care and financial support, supposedly to ensure that his medical needs would be met if anything happened to his wife. Patricia had convinced him that this was a responsible precaution rather than a manipulation designed to secure her own financial future. Mrs. Hayes's decision to investigate Patricia's background had revealed a pattern of similar behavior with previous clients, including allegations of boundary violations and financial exploitation that had never been formally prosecuted but had resulted in her termination from multiple positions. The discovery that Patricia had specifically targeted vulnerable families dealing with medical crises had been devastating, but clarifying. The process of removing Patricia from their home and care arrangements had been complicated by her patient's emotional attachment and her documented concerns about Mrs. Hayes' ability to provide adequate care independently. Patricia had threatened legal action claiming wrongful termination and had attempted to convince medical professionals that removing her services would endanger her patient's recovery. Mrs. Hayes had ultimately prevailed by documenting Patricia's boundary violations and financial manipulations. But the battle had been exhausting and expensive, requiring legal representation and extensive coordination with medical professionals to establish alternative care arrangements. The experience had taught her valuable lessons about professional manipulation and the vulnerability of families during medical crises. The most important insight Mrs. Hayes shared was her recognition that people like Patricia and Jessica specifically target families during vulnerable periods when gratitude and desperation make victims less likely to question inappropriate behavior or recognize manipulation tactics. These predators understand that families dealing with medical crises are willing to accept unusual arrangements if they believe those arrangements benefit their loved one's recovery. Mrs. Hayes explained that professional manipulators often use documented medical concerns and insurance requirements to justify their recommendations, making it seem like families have no choice but to accept arrangements that serve the manipulator's interests. They exploit the complexity of medical and insurance systems to create crises that only they can solve. The legal threats that typically accompany exposure of these manipulation schemes are designed to intimidate families into accepting continued exploitation rather than fighting for their rights and autonomy. Most families lack the resources or energy to mount effective legal defenses while simultaneously managing medical crises and caregiving responsibilities. Mrs. Hayes' advice about handling the immediate crisis with Robert and Jessica was both practical and empowering. She recommended documenting everything that had occurred, including Jessica's boundary violations and the coordination with Robert's legal challenge, to establish a clear pattern of manipulation and exploitation. She suggested contacting Jessica's employing agency immediately to report the professional ethics violations and request immediate termination of services based on documented boundary crossings and conflicts of interest. Most reputable agencies have policies specifically designed to prevent the kind of situation that had developed in our home. Regarding Robert's legal threats, Mrs. Hayes recommended consulting with a family law attorney who specialized in medical custody issues to understand the actual strength of his position and the options available for protecting Michael's current care arrangements. Legal threats were often more intimidating than legally sound, especially when they were motivated by personal agenda rather than legitimate medical concerns. Most importantly, Mrs. Hayes emphasized the need to involve Michael directly in decisions about his own care and living arrangements, rather than allowing Robert and Jessica to present their plan as inevitable or medically necessary. As an adult, Michael had the right to choose his own caregiving arrangements and living situation, regardless of what others believed was best for him. Mrs. Hayes' confidence in my instincts and judgment felt like a lifeline during a time when everyone else seemed to be questioning my competence and motivations. Her validation that my concerns about Jessica's behavior were justified and appropriate gave me the courage to trust my own perceptions rather than submitting to professional and legal pressure. The historical perspective she provided about her own similar experience helped me understand that this was not a unique situation, but rather a recognized pattern of exploitation that targeted vulnerable families during medical crises. Knowing that others had faced similar challenges and successfully overcome them made the current crisis feel manageable rather than overwhelming. Mrs. Hayes' practical advice about documentation, agency reporting, and legal consultation provided a concrete action plan for addressing the immediate threats while protecting Michael's interests and our family's autonomy. Her suggestions transformed what had felt like an impossible situation into a series of manageable steps toward resolution. As I prepared to leave Mrs. Hayes's warm kitchen and return to face the crisis in my own home, she offered one final piece of wisdom that would guide my actions in the difficult days ahead. She reminded me that sometimes the most loving thing a parent can do is fight battles that seem impossible to win, because surrendering to manipulation and exploitation teaches children that they are powerless to protect themselves and their loved ones. Her words gave me the strength to walk back across the street and begin the difficult process of reclaiming my home, my authority as Michael's mother, and our family's right to make decisions based on love rather than manipulation. The wisdom, Keeper had provided exactly what I needed most: perspective, validation, and practical guidance for the battles ahead.